The sound arrived first. Not the screaming that came later, but the strange, rhythmic rustling of hundreds of feet moving through sugarcane. Private First Class Anthony Marchetti, crouched in a hastily dug foxhole on the northern edge of Tanapag Plain, Saipan, heard it just after 0300 hours on July 7, 1944. His hands found the Browning automatic rifle before his mind fully registered what was happening. 20 rounds in the magazine, 19.4 pounds of walnut and steel. In approximately 90 seconds, those 20 rounds would need to do something the Marine Corps manual never quite prepared him for. Stop what appeared to be every Japanese soldier left alive on the island. This is the story of how American industrial firepower, concentrated in the hands of one exhausted rifleman, collided with Japanese imperial doctrine at its most desperate. It's about what happens when belief systems, one rooted in spiritual transcendence, the other, in manufacturing capacity, meet in the dark with no room for theory. The Browning automatic rifle wasn't supposed to win battles alone. Designed by John Moses Browning in 1918, adopted by the United States Army that same year, the weapon entered the Second World War as something of an anachronism, a hybrid between a true machine gun and a standard infantry rifle that satisfied neither role completely. At 20 pounds, fully loaded with its 20-round magazine, it was too heavy to be wielded like an Monet Garand. Yet it lacked the sustained fire capability and belt-fed ammunition system that defined proper machine guns like the Browning M1917 or the German MG42. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. What the BAR offered instead was something the Marine Corps had learned to value in the Pacific: immediate, portable, overwhelming firepower at the squad level. Each 12-man rifle squad included one bar gunner and one assistant who carried extra magazines. The gunner could deliver semi-automatic aimed fire like a rifleman, or switch to full automatic and pour out 500 to 650 rounds per minute, though only for the 4 seconds it took to empty a magazine. This made the BAR less a weapon of sustained suppression and more a tool for shock. Sudden, violent bursts designed to break enemy momentum at critical moments. The doctrine was simple enough in the training manuals at Camp Pendleton. The BAR gunner positioned himself to cover the most dangerous avenue of approach. The assistant fed him magazines. The rifleman protected the gunner's flanks. Fire discipline meant short bursts, 3 to 5 rounds, to conserve ammunition and prevent the barrel from overheating. Interlocking fields of fire. Mutual support. Textbook stuff. But Saipan had spent 5 weeks teaching Marchetti. That doctrine looked different when filtered through jungle heat, coral dust, and the particular kind of exhaustion that comes from sleeping 2 hours a night while Japanese infiltrators probe your lines in the darkness. The 2nd Marine Division had landed on the island's southwestern beaches on June 15th, part of Operation Forager, the American drive into the Mariana Islands. The strategic arithmetic was straightforward. Saipan placed American B-29 bombers within range of the Japanese home islands. Tokyo understood this arithmetic too, which was why the island's 32,000 Japanese defenders fought with a desperation that shocked even Pacific War veterans. By early July, the organized Japanese defense had collapsed. American forces controlled most of the island. Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito, commanding Japanese forces on Saipan, faced a situation that Imperial Japanese Army doctrine had never seriously contemplated. Inevitable, imminent defeat with no possibility of evacuation or reinforcement. The American supply system was simply too vast. Ships arrived daily with ammunition, food, water, fuel, replacement equipment. The industrial disparity wasn't subtle. A single American division consumed more supplies in one day than an entire Japanese division used in a week. Saito's remaining forces, perhaps 4,000 combat effectives and thousands of wounded, along with civilian Japanese settlers, had retreated to Saipan's northern tip, compressed into an ever-shrinking pocket around Marpi Point. American artillery zeroed in on known positions. Naval gunfire from offshore destroyers arrived whenever observers called for it. Marine corsairs strafed and bombed on request. The Japanese had some artillery pieces left, some mortars, rifles, grenades. What they didn't have was a future. Imperial Japanese military philosophy, however, provided a framework for exactly this scenario. Gyokusai, the shattering of the jewel, represented a fard, tactical and spiritual concept rooted in Bushido tradition. When defeat became certain, when no strategic alternative remained, Japanese forces were expected to launch a final, all-out assault designed not to win, but to inflict maximum casualties while dying honorably. The Senjin-kun military code, issued to all Japanese soldiers in 1941, was explicit. Do not live in shame as a prisoner. Die to avoid leaving behind a name of infamy. The practical military logic wasn't entirely absent. A massive night assault might temporarily break American lines, overrun artillery positions, perhaps reach supply dumps, and destroy stockpiles. It might kill hundreds of Americans, maybe force a temporary withdrawal. Buy time for what? Nothing changed the fundamental situation. But Gyokusai wasn't about changing situations. It was about choosing the manner of death when death was certain. On July 6th, Saito issued his final orders. The attack would come before dawn on July 7th. Every able-bodied Japanese soldier, sailor, construction worker, and civilian who could hold a weapon would participate. Some units still had rifles and bayonets. Others carried bamboo, spears, swords, even baseball bats. The walking wounded would join. The goal was simple. Break through American lines at their apparent weakest point, the junction between the 2nd and 27th Divisions near Tanapag, and drive south, killing Americans until Japanese forces were annihilated. American intelligence suspected something was coming. The usual nighttime probing attacks had stopped. That absence of contact made Marines nervous. Marchetti's company, dug in along the boundary between the two divisions, had been reinforced with additional machine gun positions and a 37mm anti-tank gun, whose crew had nothing to shoot at, except, theoretically, massed infantry. Officers told squad leaders to expect a possible attack. They didn't say Banzai charge, because that term, by July 1944, carried almost supernatural connotations among Marines who'd faced them. Marchetti had joined the 2nd Marine Division in April 1943, after the Guadalcanal campaign ended. He missed that particular horror but arrived in time for Tarawa in November 1943, where he'd first encountered the distinctive Japanese approach to defensive warfare: concrete pillboxes, interlocking fields of fire, a willingness to die in place rather than withdraw. Tarawa taught him that Japanese soldiers didn't surrender. They fought from prepared positions until killed, or they launched close-range attacks with grenades and bayonets when their defensive positions became untenable. But Tarawa's defenders had fought from static positions. They'd made Americans come to them, channeling Marine assaults into killing zones, exacting a terrible price for every yard of coral. What Marchetti hadn't yet experienced, what the Corps tried to prepare him for but couldn't really convey, was the inverse scenario. Thousands of Japanese soldiers coming directly at you, in the dark, believing their death in the next few minutes was predetermined and acceptable. The sound of rustling sugarcane, then, at 0300 hours, carried implications his training had outlined but experience hadn't filled in. Marchetti's foxhole was positioned 30 yards behind the front line of Marine positions, with interlocking fields of fire covering the approaches through a sugarcane field to his front. His assistant, Private Eddie Kowalski, was supposedly sleeping in the hole, but sat up when Marchetti's breathing changed. "You hear that?" Marchetti whispered. Kowalski listened. The rustling continued, getting louder. Then came other sounds: metal clinking, the scuff of boots, low voices speaking Japanese. Too many voices. Way too many voices. A Marine in a forward foxhole fired a single shot, the crack of an Mon Garand sharp in the humid air. Then silence. Then the screaming started. It wasn't the scream of men being shot. It was deliberately a war cry, amplified by hundreds, then thousands of throats. Banzai! 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 The Japanese word meant 10,000 years, a traditional blessing for the emperor's eternal reign, But in this context, it meant something else. We are charging. We are not stopping. We welcome death. Marchetti flipped the BAR's selector switch to automatic. The first shapes appeared through the sugarcane 30 yards out, not individual soldiers, but a mass, a wave of bodies moving together. Forward Marine positions opened fire. Mon Garans cracked in aimed semi-automatic shots. A Browning machine gun off to Marchetti's left opened up with its deeper, heavier hammering. But the shapes kept coming, more and more of them, emerging from the sugarcane like the field itself had come alive. The doctrine said wait for the optimal moment. Let them close to within 50 yards, where the BAR's effect would be, maximized. But 50 yards was 5 seconds at a running pace, and Marchetti's brain was calculating that if he waited for optimal and the front line collapsed, those 5 seconds would put bayonets in his foxhole. 25 Japanese soldiers were clearly visible now, backlit by distant artillery flares. They weren't moving tactically, no covering fire, no bounds, just running forward with rifles and bayonets, some screaming, some silent. Behind them came more shapes, dozens more, maybe hundreds. Marchetti couldn't process the scale. He shouldered the BAR, found the front sight on the center mass of the closest shape, and pressed the trigger. The Browning roared. Recoil hammered his shoulder in rapid pulses as the weapon cycled 500 rounds per minute. The sound was distinct from other weapons heavier than a Garand, lighter than a machine gun, a rapid thud, 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 thud that echoed off the coral ground. Marchetti held the trigger for maybe 3 seconds, emptying half the magazine in a single burst at the running mass. The effect was immediate and horrifying. The first rank of Japanese soldiers crumpled, like someone had cut their strings. The BAR's 30-06 rounds hit with devastating force at close range, each bullet carrying enough energy to penetrate multiple bodies, if they were aligned correctly. The men behind tripped over the falling bodies, stumbled, kept coming. Marchetti adjusted his aim slightly right, fired another burst. The barrel was already heating up. His ears were ringing despite the chaos. 4 seconds. The magazine was empty. His hands moved automatically through the reload drill. Release magazine, let it drop, pull fresh magazine from pouch, insert, slap the base to seat it, pull charging handle. Maybe 3 seconds total, but in those 3 seconds the Japanese advance covered another 15 yards. They were close enough now that Marchetti could see faces, individual expressions of rage or determination or something beyond. Either. He fired again. Short bursts this time, 3 to 4 rounds, the way the manual specified. Each burst found targets because there were too many targets to miss. A Japanese soldier armed with only a bayonet-tipped rifle went down. Another, carrying what looked like a sword, spun and fell. The BAR was doing what it was designed to do, breaking an assault's momentum through concentrated firepower. But there were so many of them. Kowalski was firing his Monet now, the semi-automatic shots, methodical and aimed. The machine gun to Marchetti's left was pouring continuous fire into the mass. Artillery began landing American 105mm shells requested earlier, arriving now with perfect, terrible timing, exploding among the Japanese forces still emerging from the sugarcane. The combined firepower was annihilating. Bodies piled up 30, 40 yards out. The charge's forward momentum was breaking, but not stopping. The Japanese doctrine of Gyokusai didn't include a withdrawal plan, because withdrawal wasn't the point. Men climbed over the dead and kept running forward. Some were wounded, limping, but still coming. Marchetti saw a Japanese soldier take a direct hit from a Garand round, stagger, somehow stay upright, and take 3 more running steps before collapsing. The spiritual preparation for death, the acceptance of annihilation, created a kind of tactical momentum that absorbed casualties which would have broken any Western attack. Marchetti's second magazine ran dry. He reloaded and realized his hands were shaking. How many magazines did he have left? 6? 7? How many Japanese were still out there? The questions arrived without answers. He fired again, aiming at shapes that were now close enough to throw grenades. One did, the grenade fell short, exploded harmlessly in a shell crater. Another Japanese soldier made it to within 10 yards of a forward Marine position before 3 Marines killed him simultaneously. The charge's main weight had hit the weakest point in American lines, the organizational boundary between divisions where communication was always slightly less efficient, where supporting fires were slightly less coordinated. Some Japanese soldiers broke through, overran forward positions, and got into the rear areas where they attacked supply dumps and headquarters units. Chaos erupted across a 2-mile front. But at Marchetti's position, at this specific 60-yard section of line, the charge was failing. The BAR, the machine gun, the concentrated rifle fire, the artillery, the combined weight of American firepower was too much. After perhaps 10 minutes, though, Marchetti's sense of time had collapsed into a continuous present. The pressure eased. Fewer shapes were emerging from the sugarcane. The screaming had diminished. Japanese soldiers were still out there, still trying to advance, but individuals now, not waves. American flares turned night into flickering day. Bodies covered the ground, between Marchetti's foxhole and the sugarcane. Some were moving, wounded, trying to crawl forward or back. Marines held fire on the obviously wounded, but kept shooting anyone who stood or raised a weapon. Marchetti's hands were blistered from the BAR's hot barrel guard. His shoulder ached from recoil. He'd fired maybe 12 magazines, 240 rounds. The barrel was so hot, the air above it shimmered. Kowalski was counting bodies aloud in the surreal way exhaustion makes normal. 17, 18, 19 just in our sector. Officers were shouting for status reports. Second squad, report. Third squad, check in. The chain of command was reconstituting itself. But the night wasn't over. Everyone knew it. This had been the first wave, or the main wave, but Japanese forces were still out there in the darkness. The dawn would reveal the true scale. Dawn on July 7th revealed what darkness had partially concealed. The Tanapag Plain, which 12 hours earlier had been contested ground, now resembled an abattoir. American estimates eventually counted more than 4,000 Japanese dead in the immediate attack zone, with bodies stacked in some areas 3 and 4 deep, where interlocking machine gun fire had caught them. Marchetti's sector alone accounted for 47 confirmed Japanese dead within a 100-yard radius of his position. Not all from his BAR, the machine gun had done terrible work, and artillery had killed dozens more, but enough that when his company commander inspected the position at 0600 hours, he simply stared at the scene for 30 seconds before asking if Marchetti was wounded. He wasn't. Kowalski had taken shrapnel from a Japanese grenade in his left forearm. Nothing serious. But Marchetti's BAR was in bad shape. He'd fired an estimated 400 rounds through it in bursts that violated every doctrine about heat management and barrel life. The barrel was discolored from heat stress. The gas cylinder showed scoring. A Marine Corps armourer who examined it later that day recommended it be pulled from service for rebuild. But on the morning of July 7th, it still functioned, which was all that mattered. The broader tactical picture emerged slowly through the morning. The Japanese charge had indeed broken through American lines in several places. At the junction point between the 2nd and 27th Divisions, Japanese forces had penetrated nearly a mile into rear areas, overrunning 2 artillery batteries and killing their crews before being contained. Medical facilities were attacked. Wounded Japanese soldiers fought American corpsmen with bayonets and bare hands. One Japanese soldier was found dead clutching a Springfield rifle he'd taken from a killed Marine, having apparently used it until he ran out of ammunition. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. But the charge had failed in its operational objective. American lines bent but didn't break. By 0800 hours on July 7th, organized Japanese resistance had effectively ended. Small groups of survivors scattered into Saipan's northern hills and caves, where they would be hunted down over the following days. Lieutenant General Saito had committed suicide in his command post before the attack began, following the samurai tradition of seppuku. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo, who'd commanded the carrier strike force at Pearl Harbor and now found himself trapped on Saipan, also committed suicide that morning. With the military leadership dead and the assault shattered, Japanese resistance dissolved into individual last stands. The human cost was staggering. American casualties from the Banzai charge numbered over 650, including 126, killed, the highest single-day casualty figure for American forces on Saipan. But Japanese losses were catastrophic. Beyond the 4,000 killed in the assault itself, the subsequent American advance into northern Saipan over the next 2 days encountered mass civilian suicides at Marpi Point, where Japanese civilians, convinced by propaganda that Americans would torture and kill them, jumped from cliffs or detonated grenades rather than surrender. American forces, attempting to prevent the suicides, with loudspeaker appeals and offers of safety, watched helplessly as families threw their children off cliffs before jumping themselves. The strategic implications rippled outward. Saipan's fall on July 9, 1944, placed American B-29s within range of Tokyo. More immediately, it triggered a political crisis in Japan. Prime Minister Hideki Tojo, who'd led Japan into war in 1941, resigned on July 18 in the aftermath of Saipan's loss. The Imperial Japanese Navy had effectively ceased to exist as a fighting force after the Battle of the Philippine Sea in mid-June. Japan's defensive perimeter, the strategic boundary it had fought to establish and hold, was collapsing. But the tactical question that haunted American planners was more immediate. What did the Saipan Banzai charge reveal about Japanese intentions as American forces moved closer to the home islands? If 4,000 men would launch a suicide attack on Saipan, knowing it would fail, accepting death as the predetermined outcome, what would the entire Japanese population do when American forces reached Japan itself? The Browning automatic rifle hadn't been designed with this specific scenario in mind. John Moses Browning, the weapon's creator, had conceived it during the First World War as an answer to trench warfare's firepower problem. American doctrine in 1918 emphasized mobile infantry assault, moving forward under covering fire, overwhelming German trenches through speed and shock. The bar was meant to provide that mobile fire, a weapon one man could carry and operate while advancing, delivering suppressive fire that pinned defenders while riflemen closed in. The weapon's mechanics reflected this purpose. Gas-operated, air-cooled, magazine-fed. The gas system tapped propellant gases from the barrel to cycle the action, ejecting spent casings and chambering fresh rounds automatically. This made it heavier than a standard rifle. The gas, cylinder, piston, and operating rod added several pounds, but enabled sustained automatic fire without the complexity of a belt-fed system. The 20-round detachable magazine was a compromise. A 30-round magazine would have been too long, throwing off the weapon's balance. A drum magazine, like the Thompson submachine gun used, would have added too much weight and complexity. What emerged was a weapon that excelled in no single role, but provided flexibility across several. In semi-automatic mode, it functioned as a highly accurate rifle, capable of precise shots out to 600 yards. In automatic mode, it delivered suppressive fire comparable to a light machine gun, though only for brief periods before the magazine ran dry. The weight penalty meant BAR gunners couldn't keep pace with riflemen during sustained advances, but in defensive positions or deliberate attacks, the weapon provided squad-level firepower that could break enemy concentrations. The Pacific War transformed how Marines employed the BAR. Jungle fighting on Guadalcanal, New Britain, and Tarawa revealed that firepower density mattered more than mobility across extended lines. In dense vegetation where visibility rarely exceeded 50 yards, the ability to deliver overwhelming fire at the point of contact often decided engagements. Japanese defensive tactics relied on concealment and surprise machine gun nests hidden in vegetation, snipers in trees, infantry waiting in spider holes. American doctrine evolved to emphasize immediate, violent response to contact. Saturate the area with fire. Fix the enemy position. Maneuver to flank. The BAR fit this evolved doctrine perfectly. When a Marine patrol encountered Japanese fire, the BAR gunner provided immediate suppression, while riflemen identified the threat and maneuvered. The weapon's portability meant it was always present at the point of contact, unlike heavier machine guns that required setup time. Its 20-round magazine, initially seen as a limitation, proved adequate for the short, violent engagements typical of jungle combat. But the Banzai charge presented a different tactical problem. Here, the enemy wasn't concealed or seeking cover. Japanese forces were advancing in the open, accepting casualties, relying on momentum and numbers to overwhelm positions before American firepower could stop them. This inverted the usual Pacific War engagement pattern. Instead of hunting concealed enemies, Marines faced masses of exposed targets. The limiting factor wasn't target acquisition but ammunition, supply, and barrel heat. Marchetti's experience illustrated the BAR's effectiveness and limitations in this scenario. 400 rounds fired in perhaps 15 minutes represented extraordinary output for a single-man weapon. The M1917 machine gun, by comparison, could fire 400 rounds in less than a minute, but it required a crew of 3 to 6 men, water for cooling, and a prepared position. The German MG-42 was even faster, capable of 1,200 rounds per minute, but similarly crew-served and position-dependent. The BAR's advantage was that one exhausted Marine in a hasty foxhole could operate it effectively without assistance, though Kowalski's presence feeding magazines was certainly helpful. The psychological dimension of facing a Banzai charge defied easy analysis. American military psychiatrists, studying combat stress reactions throughout the war, identified several factors that increased psychological trauma: helplessness, isolation, proximity to death, witnessing extreme violence. The Banzai charge combined all of these. Marines described a specific kind of fear, not the fear of dying, which was omnipresent in combat, but fear of being overrun, of fighting hand-to-hand with bayonets and rifle butts, of the intimate violence that came when defensive lines collapsed. Japanese military psychology approached death from fundamentally different premises. The Senjin-kun Code, distributed to all Japanese military personnel in 1941, explicitly framed capture as worse than death. Do not suffer the disgrace of being captured alive. Do not die leaving behind a name soiled by misdeeds. This wasn't merely propaganda. Japanese military training from initial conscription emphasized surrender to dishonored family, ancestors, and the emperor. Soldiers were taught that death in battle guaranteed spiritual elevation, that dying for the emperor was the highest purpose a Japanese man could achieve. This ideological framework made tactical sense of operationally nonsensical decisions. From a purely military perspective, the Saipan Banzai charge accomplished nothing. It didn't change the strategic situation, didn't recapture lost ground, didn't meaningfully degrade American combat power. 4,000 Japanese soldiers died to kill 126 Americans, a casualty exchange ratio of 30-1 in America's favor. Any conventional military calculus would reject this as catastrophic waste. But Gyokusai wasn't measured by conventional calculus. The charge's purpose was spiritual and cultural as much as military. Japanese forces demonstrated they would choose death over surrender, maintaining honor according to Bushido principles, even in defeat. The message was directed as much at the Japanese home population and imperial leadership as at American forces. Your soldiers will not quit, will not break, will die before accepting subjugation. American forces received this message clearly. After Saipan, as planning proceeded for operations against Tinian, Guam, and eventually the Philippines, American commanders incorporated the assumption that Japanese forces would fight to annihilation into their operational planning. Casualty estimates rose. Ammunition allocations increased. Medical facilities were expanded to handle the anticipated wounded. The closer American forces approached the Japanese home islands, the more intense resistance was expected to become. The industrial arithmetic, however, remained unchanged. American factories in 1944 produced war materiel at scales that dwarfed Japanese capacity. The United States manufactured over 96,000 aircraft that year. Japan produced 28,000. American shipyards launched multiple aircraft carriers, battleships, and destroyers monthly. Japanese shipyards struggled to replace losses. In small arms alone, American production of the Moan-Garand exceeded 4 million units during the war. Japanese Arisaka rifle production totaled approximately 3.5 million across the entire war period. This production disparity manifested directly on battlefields like Saipan. Marchetti's 400 rounds of BAR ammunition represented perhaps $2 worth of American industrial output, essentially free from a military budgeting perspective. Supply ships arrived at Saipan daily carrying millions of rounds of small arms, ammunition, artillery shells, mortar rounds, grenades. When Marchetti's company ran low on ammunition, a request submitted through normal supply channels resulted in fresh magazines delivered to his foxhole within hours. Japanese forces had no equivalent system. Ammunition resupply on Saipan after mid-June was essentially impossible. The few Japanese ships that attempted to run the American blockade were sunk. Submarines couldn't carry enough supplies to matter. By early July, Japanese soldiers were fighting with whatever ammunition they'd conserved since the American landing 3 weeks earlier. When that ran out, they fought with bayonets, swords, and sharpened bamboo. The Banzai charge included men armed with literally nothing but sticks, because that was all available. The material disparity extended to every aspect of warfare. American forces on Saipan had access to naval gunfire support from offshore ships, effectively unlimited artillery available on request. Japanese forces had some artillery pieces remaining, but shells were scarce, and guns couldn't be moved once American observers located them. American wounded received morphine, plasma, sulfur drugs, and evacuation to hospital ships within hours. Japanese wounded received whatever medical supplies remained in devastated aid stations, if they received anything at all. Yet, ideology and material reality created parallel universes of interpretation. To American observers, the Banzai charge was evidence that Japanese military doctrine had divorced itself from rational calculation, that cultural factors had overridden tactical logic to the point of mass suicide. To Japanese participants, the charge represented the ultimate fulfillment of military virtue, choosing death with honor over life, with shame, maintaining spiritual purity even in physical defeat. Neither interpretation was entirely wrong, but neither captured the full complexity. Japanese officers ordering the charge understood perfectly well that it would fail militarily. Saito's final orders acknowledged this implicitly. But they also understood that no alternative existed which preserved both life and honor within the value system they inhabited. American officers observing the charge understood that Japanese forces were dying in droves, but struggled to comprehend why enemy soldiers would continue attacking into obviously lethal fire when withdrawal might preserve lives for continued resistance. The tactical resolution of this cultural and material collision was brutally simple. American firepower won. The BAR, the machine gun, the artillery, the industrial system that produced unlimited ammunition and replacement equipment. This combination annihilated Japanese forces, regardless of their willingness to die. Marchetti didn't need to understand Japanese Bushido philosophy to defend his position. He needed a functioning weapon, sufficient ammunition, and the physical stamina to keep firing. The aftermath of the Saipan Banzai charge influenced American planning for the rest of the Pacific War. When planners estimated casualties for the proposed invasion of Kyushu, the southernmost Japanese home island, scheduled for November 1945, they assumed Japanese forces would fight with Saipan-level intensity, multiplied across an entire nation. If 4,000 men launched a suicide charge on Saipan, what would millions of Japanese civilians and soldiers do when Americans landed on sacred home soil? These casualty estimates eventually contributed to the decision to use atomic weapons against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in August 1945. The calculation was coldly arithmetic. Hundreds of thousands dead from atomic weapons versus potentially millions dead from invasion and continued conventional warfare. Whether this arithmetic was accurate remains historically debated, but the Saipan Banzai charge factored directly into the strategic thinking that produced it. For Marchetti specifically, the war continued. After Saipan was secured, the 2nd Marine Division rested and refitted in the Hawaiian Islands, preparing for the invasion of Okinawa, scheduled for April 1945. Marchetti's unit was ultimately held in reserve for Okinawa and didn't participate in the initial assault. The war ended in August before the 2nd Division deployed again. Marchetti returned home to Pennsylvania in October 1945, was discharged in November, and resumed civilian life. He rarely spoke about Saipan. In later interviews, conducted by military historians in the 1980s, Marchetti described the Banzai charge with technical precision, the number of magazines fired, the barrel heat problem, the reloading procedure, but avoided discussing his emotional state during the engagement. When asked directly what he felt while firing, he said, "I don't remember feeling anything except my shoulder hurting from the recoil and worrying the gun would jam." This emotional numbing was typical of combat veterans describing extreme violence. The human mind protects itself during overwhelming stress by narrowing focus to immediate physical tasks. Operate the weapon, change magazines, identify targets. Emotional processing happens later, if at all. Many veterans of the Pacific War carried psychological scars that weren't recognized or treated by mid-20th century psychiatry. Post-traumatic stress disorder wasn't officially defined until 1980, what earlier generations called shell shock or combat. Fatigue or simply weakness was often untreated trauma. The Browning automatic rifle itself remained in American military service until the 1950s, when it was gradually replaced by the M14 rifle and M60 machine gun. The weapon's basic design, however, influenced subsequent automatic rifle development worldwide. The Soviet RPD, the German FG-42, the American M14 all reflected the lessons learned from the BAR's combination of portability and firepower. Specific BARs that saw combat rarely survived the war intact. The weapons were heavily used, often damaged, and generally rebuilt or scrapped afterward. Whether Marchetti's particular BAR, the one that fired 400 rounds on the night of July 6th and 7th, 1944 survived, is unknown. Serial numbers weren't consistently tracked in after-action reports. The weapon likely went into depot maintenance, was rebuilt with new parts, and issued to another unit, or sold as surplus after the war. What survived instead was the tactical lesson that even spiritually prepared, ideologically committed soldiers attacking with suicidal determination could be stopped by concentrated firepower operated by individual riflemen if those riflemen had adequate weapons and ammunition. The material basis of warfare production capacity, logistics, industrial output ultimately overwhelmed cultural and psychological factors. Japan's Bushido tradition couldn't compensate for America's manufacturing capacity. This lesson shaped Cold War American military doctrine. The emphasis on firepower, on technological superiority, on maintaining production capacity to sustain high-intensity warfare, these became foundational assumptions. The Vietnam War later complicated these assumptions by demonstrating that firepower superiority didn't guarantee political victory, but the core principle remained. American forces would enter conflicts with material advantages that compensated for potentially more motivated adversaries. For the individual Japanese soldiers who died in the Saipan Banzai charge, their sacrifice meant something different. To the extent their families learned of their deaths, and many never received confirmation, they died honorably in service to the emperor. In Japan's collective memory of the war, these soldiers weren't wasted lives but examples of ultimate devotion. The cultural framework that produced Gyokusai didn't disappear with Japan's defeat. It was recontextualized into narratives of tragic nobility and wasted youth. The civilians who died at Marpi Point represented a darker legacy. They weren't soldiers choosing death in battle. They were non-combatants, including children who died because propaganda had convinced them that American occupation meant torture and death. Their deaths demonstrated how thoroughly total war, combined with ideological indoctrination, could distort human survival instincts. American forces, witnessing the mass suicides, recognized that defeating Japan militarily wouldn't be sufficient. The population's willingness to die rather than accept occupation suggested that invasion would produce casualties far exceeding anything seen in Europe. These calculations became moot when Japan surrendered in August 1945, following the atomic bombings and Soviet entry into the war. The surrender itself violated every principle embedded in Japanese military culture. The Emperor's radio address on August 15th was the first time most Japanese civilians had heard his voice, and his instruction to endure the unendurable meant accepting defeat and occupation. That Japanese forces largely complied with surrender orders rather than continuing resistance suggests that the Bushido ideology was less universally internalized than wartime propaganda claimed. The Saipan Banzai charge, then, stands as a moment of pure collision between incompatible systems, material versus spiritual, industrial versus ideological, calculation versus conviction. In that collision, 20 rounds from a Browning automatic rifle, multiplied across hundreds of American positions, shattered an assault by thousands of men prepared to die. The BAR didn't win through superior technology. It was a 1918 design facing tactics that hadn't fundamentally changed since medieval warfare. It won through availability, reliability, and the industrial system that ensured every American squad had one, plus unlimited ammunition. Marchetti's experience, one man, one weapon, one night, represented the Pacific War's essential dynamic reduced to individual scale. He wasn't a hero in the conventional sense. He didn't single-handedly stop the charge. Dozens of machine guns, artillery batteries, and rifle squads contributed. He simply did what his training and equipment enabled, delivered sustained firepower at the critical moment. That this was sufficient to help break a mass assault by spiritually prepared. Enemy forces reflected not individual heroism, but systematic advantages in industrial capacity and logistics. The lesson wasn't that American soldiers were braver or more skilled than Japanese soldiers. Individual courage and tactical skill were distributed equally across both forces. The lesson was that courage and skill operated within material constraints. Japan's soldiers were willing to die for their beliefs. America's soldiers had weapons, ammunition, and support systems that made the Japanese willingness to die tactically irrelevant. When the two systems collided on Saipan's coral plains, industrial capacity defeated spiritual conviction through sheer weight of metal. This remains uncomfortable knowledge. We prefer to believe that human factors, courage, determination, tactical brilliance, decide battles. The reality is messier. Logistics, production capacity, and material superiority often matter more than individual valor. The Saipan Banzai charge demonstrated this with terrible clarity. 4,000 men, convinced their deaths served a higher purpose, died achieving almost nothing because they faced an enemy with unlimited ammunition and the industrial base to produce more whenever needed. For Marchetti, sitting in his foxhole as dawn revealed the scope of what had happened, the philosophical implications weren't immediately apparent. He saw bodies. He smelled cordite and blood and the sweet sick odor of death in tropical heat. His hands were blistered, his shoulder ached, his ears rang. The BAR beside him was too hot to touch. These were the immediate, physical realities. Understanding what it all meant would come later, if at all. Thank you for reading. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.